Hello Internet, I'm Father Casey Cole, Franciscan friar and Catholic priest, and today I'm answering your questions about Vatican II. Let's clear up some misconceptions. What even is an ecumenical council? Excellent question, important to know this from the start. An ecumenical council is a general meeting of bishops to discuss theological and pastoral matters bearing the supreme authority of the Church. This is different from a synod or conference, regional or less formal gatherings of bishops that act as more consultative to the Pope. In the history of the Catholic Church, there have been 21 such meetings, the first 7 of which were attended by both the East and West before the Schism. Why did Vatican II even need to happen? Wasn't the faith already flourishing? This is a really fascinating question because yes, the Catholic Church was flourishing in some ways in some parts of the world. Churches were being built and dioceses were growing. Many people were surprised, in fact, when Pope John XXIII called for the council in 1959. But that's not to say that the council came out of nowhere or wasn't necessary. For one thing, the Church wasn't exactly flourishing everywhere, just in Europe and North America. In Africa, Asia, and Latin America, the Church was still pretty small at the time. But even in Europe and North America, let's not confuse high mass attendance with flourishing. In many of these countries, catechesis was sparse and involvement beyond the Mass was low. People were very devotional, but how much of this was the result of cultural pressures? Even if there weren't major problems at the time, what the Church recognized was a major untapped potential in the laity. We were in need of a revival. How was the agenda set for Vatican II? The council was guided by 2 guiding principles, the French word ressourcement, meaning to return to the sources, and the Italian word aggiornamento, updating. The desire was never to be more like the Protestants or to be more worldly or liberal, but conversely to rediscover and implement aspects of our tradition that had been lost or overlooked in order to be more effective in the modern world. Despite the common misconception, this was not something that came about all of a sudden in the 1960s like a quick revolution, but was the result of a decade-long recovery of historical documents and the improvement of theological studies in the late 19th century. Vatican II is the culmination of the prior reform movements of scripture, patristics, liturgy, and ecumenism that had been taking place for decades. Why did Vatican II change the Catholic religion and turn it into something more Protestant? Again, this is a very common misconception stemming, I'm guessing, entirely from the changes to the liturgy, but it's really not true. Besides what I've just said about our emphasis on returning to tradition, the driving force of the council was not to make the Church more Protestant or like the world, but to mobilize the laity. Prophets could definitely see the cracks in society coming as a result of secularism, and knew that if the Church was going to thrive in the modern world, it needed to rely on lay people. It was this focus that called for the reform and simplification of the liturgy, the insistence on translating and reading the Bible, the centrality of baptism and universal call to holiness, and the prominence of family and civil leaders in reforming the world. It's sort of true, I guess, that parts of the liturgy began to resemble more of a Protestant tradition, but the essential focus on the Eucharist never changed, and we actually doubled down on the primacy of the bishop, restored the permanent diaconate, and continued to assert the Catholic Church as the fullness of the truth. The fact that we emphasized the Word, ecumenism, and evangelization wasn't us trying to be more like the Protestants, it was us getting back to our essential nature. Did Sacrosanctum Concilium envision the modern Novus Ordo? Because the document looks like it only expected minor reforms. Sacrosanctum Concilium, the document on the liturgy, definitely didn't envision what we have today, but it also didn't envision minor reforms either. As I've just mentioned, the overall purpose of the council was to better include the laity. Sacrosanctum Concilium emphasized this by calling for full, active, and conscious participation. For this to be possible, certain things, even big things, needed to be simplified and changed to allow for the general population to follow along. This means the use of the vernacular or common language, the inclusion of local customs, allowance of colloquial music, the restoration of the prayers of the faithful, and the sharing of the cup with the congregation. All of these things were major changes. That said, each of these things were envisioned, it would seem from the document, to be introduced prudently, even occasionally, not as the norm. Latin and Gregorian chant are still listed as the preferred option. Growing up, I often heard calls for Vatican II to be fully implemented. If it wasn't, why not? What would have prevented it from being fully implemented? It depends what we mean here because it could mean a lot of things. For some, there was always a desire that the spirit of Vatican II would keep going, meaning that it was only a matter of time before we had married or female priests, democratic structures, peace, and free love. This, of course, was never what the council ever meant to implement, and so those who tried to stop it weren't exactly stopping the council. On the other hand, there is definitely a sense of empowering the laity, collegiality among the bishops, and missionary drive of the whole church indicated in Vatican II that never really took off. The church remains largely a clerical, hierarchical organization run almost entirely by priests and bishops without much lay leadership. Pope Francis is only just now getting women on committees and lay people having their voices heard. Why this is exactly is hard to say, but when you've done something the same way for hundreds, even thousands of years, change does not come quickly. What was Vatican I, and what happened there to cause Vatican II? The main focus of Vatican I was to clarify Catholic theology in light of the rising philosophical movements of the 19th century, things like socialism, secularism, modernism, and rationalism. For this reason, the two constitutions that resulted from the council were Dei Filius, on the authentic revelation of faith, and Pastor Aeternus, further defining the supreme authority of the Pope to teach the faith. More was planned for the council, particularly on the nature of the church, but the Italian capture of Rome in 1870 forced the bishops to flee and the council be cut short. A lot changed in the world between 1870 and 1962, but Vatican II was the natural conclusion of Vatican I. I've heard that other Christian denominations attended, including Protestants. If so, what did they bring to the table? Along with the Catholic bishops from around the world, there were many observers and guests, not only from Protestant traditions, but from various Orthodox churches and the Old Catholic Church. They obviously did not have voting authority and did not author any of the documents, but their presence no doubt had an effect on the conversations and probably influenced some of the theology. If Vatican II is not responsible for the crisis we're in today, what is? Let's start with the first part to make that clear. Vatican II did not cause the fall of the church or society. A look to the years right after Vatican II shows tremendous social and cultural upheaval all around the world, of which the church had nothing to do with. If anything, it better prepared us to handle such revolutions. As for the real cause, finding just one thing to pin everything on is probably impossible. History is complicated with many conflicting forces at play. I think a lot of what I said in the recent video about Ireland applies to the church at large, that misused power, poor catechesis, and secularism corroded things from the inside out, but let's also not overlook the effects of World War II. Imagine a traumatic world event in which as many as 85 million people die and society is thrown completely upside down. Imagine growing up in that time or being raised by someone unable to deal with their trauma. What happens when you become 18, 25, 40? You throw off the conventions of society and live your life in a state of arrested adolescence, coming of age in the 1960s and 70s. That's got to have some effect on faith, right? Why did Pope Paul VI say that Vatican II was pastoral and not dogmatic? Honestly, I've never been clear on this. I hear people say this often, but all I can do is speculate. Unlike previous councils, Vatican II had no list of condemnations for heresies or any new dogmas. There was no creed or any innovative doctrine. All it was a reformulation and re-emphasis on the things that we'd already had in our tradition. And yet, no one can deny that there are real changes, not only in emphasis, but in substance, in regards to the identity of the church, the role of the laity, and the focus of the liturgy. If it were purely a pastoral and not a dogmatic council, I doubt so many individuals would have gone schismatic over it. How do we recognize the ancient teaching of no salvation outside the church with statements from Vatican II? I have a full-length answer to this question here, but in short, the church had always taught that there is no salvation outside the church, but Vatican II stated that Protestants, Jews, Muslims, and even atheists could be considered the people of God. This is actually not as big of a change as people might think. While our approach and tone towards non-Catholics changed at Vatican II, our theology did not. Salvation is through Christ alone, who is found in the church. But God is not bound by the church. In theory, he can save anyone he wants, but it will always be through Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. Do you feel that Vatican II has done more to unite Catholics or divide us? The real question here is, does the way we talk about Vatican II on the internet unite or divide us? The reality is that the changes that came from Vatican II were overwhelmingly positive to the vast majority of people in the church. Most everyday Catholics would not find it controversial and probably don't encounter much division from it in their everyday life. But like most things, controversies tend to brew online more than in reality. If we want unity, I'd recommend that some people just stay off the internet. Could the changes from Vatican II be undone? Depends what you mean by changes. As I said before, the main focus of the Council was on the reform and practical application of our growing theology. These things, the Council even states itself, must change with the passing of time. So yes, there will continue to be adjustments to the liturgy and mission in the future. But on the other hand, the emphasis on including the laity, the call for universal holiness, and relationship with the outside world are so significant that it's going to be hard to go back to our previous models of church. The foundational pieces of this council will not be undone by another council. And finally, if there was ever a Vatican III, what would you want changed? With every council, there is always an inciting moment or particular focus that draws the bishops together. The Arian heresy, iconoclasm, conciliarism, modernism, the need to mobilize the laity. Something to rally around. For Vatican III, there would need to be some major issue to respond to. As of now, I don't see what that might be. All of the questions of our age seem to be essentially the same questions Vatican II tried to answer. Pluralism, secularism, poor catechesis, globalization. These are still questions that Vatican II speaks to, and we're only 60 years into it. Rather than calling for a Vatican III, my hope would be that we would take seriously what the bishops have already called for. Maybe it's time for our own ressourcement and aggiornamento in our world today, to go back and look at the actual documents, and not the spirit of Vatican II, to see where our church needs to adapt to the ever-changing world now. No need to reinvent the wheel, it's just time to implement it.